Hello and welcome to my video all about how to use applique to cover up holes or stains on clothing. My previous video was all about reverse applique, which is another option if you want to repair stains or holes in clothes. Whereas that technique involved cutting out the hole or stain and then filling it in with another fabric, applique is where you use a fabric to cover up and cover over that hole or stain. I have a pair of trousers here that have been worn whilst the person has been painting, and so there are paint stains all over. Plus there's a massive hole in the knee, so these are destined for the bin, but I thought I'd use them for this demonstration. Okay, so what are you going to need to do this repair? Apart from a piece of clothing to repair, you're also going to need a small piece of fabric. This piece of fabric can be a contrast colour, it can be patterned, it can be anything you like. But if you want it to be a subtle repair, rather than something that's going to stand out, it's best you use a fabric that matches the piece of clothing you're repairing. I'm actually going to be using fabric from the trousers themselves, in order to cover up the stain in the most subtle way possible. The only important thing to note is that whatever fabric you use, it should be the same type as the clothing you're repairing. So in this case, I'm repairing woven cotton trousers. So any fabric I pick must also be woven cotton. I'm going to be attaching the applique using a fairly decorative stitch, and I don't mind this stitch being seen. So I'm going to be using a few strands of embroidery floss or embroidery thread. If, however, you want to make the stitching as invisible as possible, then feel free to use a different type of stitch and use a regular sewing thread instead. You'll also require a needle, and for that I'm going to be using an embroidery needle. Other things you're going to need include some scissors, an iron and ironing board, and some fusible web. Fusible web is great for all kinds of clothing repairs, and it's basically a glue that attaches two pieces of fabric together using the heat of an iron. Just make sure that you get the iron-on version. Okay, so how do you go about doing this applique repair? Well, first you need to identify exactly the area that you want to cover with the applique. Because I wanted to use a piece of fabric for the applique that perfectly matched the trousers, I first looked inside all the pockets to see if there was any spare fabric that I could use. There was nothing in the back pockets, but in the small front pocket I found a small piece of fabric. I then cut out a piece of this fabric that was big enough to use, but I tried to keep away from the visible area of the pocket. Later on, I attached a piece of denim over this hole using fusible web, just to make the pocket usable again. I then took the piece of trouser fabric and I cut it to the correct size. If you're covering a hole, I would suggest that it's at least 1 centimeter bigger on all sides, whereas with a stain it doesn't really matter so much. If you like, you can just attach this straight onto the clothing. However, I decided I wanted to fold the fabric edges underneath so that they didn't fray in the future. This is totally optional, and if you want to do that, you'll now need to press those sides under using an iron, like so. I cut out some of the fabric from the folded under corners to reduce the fabric bulk. You'll notice that folding these sides under makes the applique stand out more from the trouser fabric. So if you don't like that look, feel free to just attach it completely flat. Okay, so next we need to cut out a piece of fusible web that's the same size as this applique patch. You then need to trim off a thin slither, about 1 or 2 millimeters from each side. This is to make sure that the piece of fusible web is very slightly smaller than the applique patch. If you're using this method to cover up a hole rather than a stain, then there's a very important step you must do next. You have to trace around the hole in the clothing onto the center of the fusible web, and then cut that hole out. It's important that the fusible web does not cover over the holes in the clothes. We then need to go over to the ironing board and put the iron onto an appropriate heat setting. Usually people use quite a low heat setting when using fusible web, for instance the wool heat setting. However, I sometimes go up to a higher heat setting if I know that the fabric applique and the clothing can take it. Right, so you simply put the fusible web on top of the stain or the hole. Then line up the fabric applique on top. Make sure that you can see no fusible web around the applique and then press with an iron for about 10 seconds. If you're worried about damaging the clothing with the iron, you can always use a press cloth in between the applique and the iron. Once the 10 seconds are up, let the fabric cool down for a few seconds and then test around the edges to make sure that the applique has stuck. The fusible web should have melted and attached the applique to the clothing. If that hasn't happened yet, then you'll need to iron for a further few seconds until it does completely stick. So once the applique is attached, we can then get on with the stitching. I used 3 strands of black embroidery floss, and I fed these into an embroidery needle. I tend to use an arm's length of thread because then it's not so long that it easily gets tangled. Make sure to put a knot in the end. You'll need to keep the hand that you're not going to be sewing with inside the clothing, behind where you'll be stitching. This is because you need to make sure that you're not going to stitch right through to the other side of the clothing, in this case the back of the trouser leg. I'm going to be doing blanket stitch, which is a decorative stitch. If you wanted to do a more invisible stitch, then I would do very small whip stitches all the way around the applique, using a regular sewing thread. Okay, so to start blanket stitching, I would take the needle from back to front at the centre of one side of the applique. If you're doing an applique shape like a circle, you can bring the needle up anywhere along the edge. Then you need to decide how long you want the stitches to be. Usually blanket stitches are around 5mm long. So I took the needle a short distance straight across right onto the top of the applique. And then I took the needle from front to back. I like to make the thread extra secure rather than leave it just to that single knot we did at the end of the thread. So I look at the back of the applique and then I take my needle in and out of the fabric, right where the thread comes out. I tighten that thread until there's just a small loop remaining, and then take the needle through that loop and tighten. Next, bring the needle back through to the front of the trousers, going through the same hole as you first went through. In my case, I want the next stitch to sit between the first stitch and the corner of the applique. Remember, you have to plan out where you want the stitches to go in order to make them nice and even. So I move 1 stitch length along the applique edge, and then 1 stitch length across onto the applique. I go through the fabric from front to back and come up right next to the edge of the applique, straight across from where you just put the needle into the applique. You want this stitch to be parallel to the first stitch. Next, you need to make sure that the embroidery floss lies behind the needle, because you want the needle to go through the loop that we're forming. Then pull the needle through the fabric and pull the thread tight, making sure that you arrange the stitch as shown here so that it lies parallel to the first one. And now we've reached the corner stitch. So we're going to go through the fabric in the same place as we did for the last stitch. And then we're going to come up at the corner of the applique. Make sure the thread lies behind the needle, then pull the needle through and tighten the stitch so that we now create a diagonal stitch. Then we go back through the fabric at exactly the same place one more time and come up at the applique edge, like so. The idea is to create 3 stitches at the corner, one at 45 degrees and the other 2 forming a 90-degree angle. You then carry on stitching in the same manner all the way around the applique. So you go 1 stitch length along the applique edge and pull the stitch tight. Once you've completed the last stitch, you'll notice that there's a gap along the edge between the first stitch and the last. And all you do is take the needle back down through the fabric, through that first stitch right next to the applique edge. And that fills in the gap. Then you simply secure the thread to the back of the applique, as we did at the very beginning. You can then repeat this if you like, before cutting off the excess thread. And that's it, you've now completed your applique repair. I really hope you found this video helpful, and thank you very much for watching.